Hello, I'm Frankie, and we're going to be doing my podcast today. I'm going to be mainly focusing on the 100 objects of the history of the world since I found that most interesting. I love how they don't only explain the item and its historical background, but they also touch on the topics of how these innovations revolutionize the world around them. These items, such as the axe, weren't just tools for one purpose, but they somehow expanded the way of thinking. I just find the innovation of the hand axe to be really interesting. It may seem like just a hand axe, but it's the process in which you think and craft a new idea and make it reality, which I find interesting. I'm a computer information systems major, so I like to sit down, have an idea, and follow through the process to create a product or whatever I'm going to do. And so I really like the process compared to the product. And in the Hand Axe podcast, they relate the part of the brain which are using when crafting something is also used when you speak. He goes on to say that the name or the man who crafted it would roughly have the speech capabilities of a 7-year-old. I found that statement kind of like far-fetched. Like, how are you gonna reliably say that he's gonna have the speech capabilities of a 7-year-old? Being able to say something like he would have speech capabilities and they would be in this range probably would be cool, but just being able to say the capabilities of a 7-year-old is kind of odd in my opinion. They go on to talk about a hand axe that is a little large and it seems less practical than a normal one. The beauty of it is brought up, the symmetrical look with blades being on both sides, compared to just one side. They speculate that it might be more of a show item than an actual hand axe, or that it might have been an item of status or stature. It's just showing that he has a level of power and or wealth. And that's kind of cool. I like the creative aspect and just a little bit of change. I think it's cool. So let's go on to something else. Let's go on to the grinder. And it's not actually called a grinder. It is, I'm so sorry, a bird-shaped pestle. And this pestle the first one was found about 10,000 years ago in New Guinea. And it was mainly used for grasses, which are kind of like wheat. Furthermore, it was mainly plants and herbs that were gross or actually unedible unless they gone through a process of boiling or leaching. The podcast talks about how this is odd considering there are extra steps involved, making it harder to eat instead of just going for, say, an edible plant that you could just pull out of the ground and eat. Or, like, say, a nut on the ground that you could just crack open. It makes sense if you really think about it, though, in the way of acquiring food. Because if you can go for a food item that is poisonous to you and the other animals around you, then no other animals are going to be going for that item. So you're just going to have free range. Anytime you see one of those, that's yours. Nobody's going to fuck with that. And I kind of think that's kind of funny how our monkey brains literally came up with that idea and was like, oh, this item is edible if we treat it a certain way. Nobody else is going to want it, and it's just free resources at least. And I think that's really cool. That's where we really shine compared to some other animals. Food is a universal necessity. Nothing can survive without the needed nutrients. So having a surplus or a constant supply is the first step in having a colony, a large group of individuals who could work together. With that, you're essentially creating the first step for society, a community. This is where really creative and beautiful things are brought about. It's cool seeing where and how things are started and where we as a people really start to thrive instead of just survive. Um, and I think that's really cool how in the podcast they're talking about a grinder, yet we're still relating it to the start of a civilization. It's not just about the grinder, it's the process, the way of thinking from getting to point A to point B. It's not the item that you create that's important, it's how you created it. And I think that's pretty cool. Now, let's talk about Japan and their pots. They had some cool pots. It was in Japan that the world's first pot was born, and along with that, also the first stew was created. Kind of need a pot to make a stew, so it makes sense. And I kind of just thought that was a fun little fact, so I threw that in there. I never really realized how much art and storytelling was portrayed through pots in Japan. At first, I'm sure they were just a means to like eat and cook food, but when was the transition into a more creative side of things? And the Jomon people, the Jomon is a term meaning of the people or period, and not just a type of pot. It was also in Japan, so Jomon was like the people, even though now we call it a Jomon pot, and that's recognized as the pot. It was more of a people or like a period that they were in. And Japan is an interesting place to have pots because they were big into hunting and gathering, and throughout history, mainly the only people who used pots were farmers who were located in one area because they're a farmer and they have land to tend to, and relied. And it was weird because they were semi-fragile, right? And in awkward shape, so traveling with them wasn't really feasible. And this is why it's interesting that the Jomon started using them, because they weren't really, they didn't really need to do that. They didn't really have crops. They lived in Japan, and Japan was a very plentiful. You had the ocean to pull from, you had plants, you had animals. It wasn't really a barren land. You didn't really need to farm to be able to get the food you needed. And so I think that's really interesting how they, even though they don't have this agriculture, they still use pots to their advantage. And it really is just expands your mind into thinking of different things. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I really enjoyed the way that Jomon portrayed art through the pots with multiple different styles. It wasn't only a way to store food, and I think that speaks on how civilized they were and how much they were actually thriving as a people. And yeah, it's pretty cool, in my opinion at least. Let's talk about the writing tablets. The early forms of writing was about keeping records, not a form or art or way to portray or tell a story. The accountants got a hold of writing tablets before the poets. And that was a quote in the podcast, and I thought that was a pretty cool one. The first writing is in Mesopotamia, was about organizing the state. A Mesopotamia poem put words on clay since it was so durable, even though it's not the best way to store writing, but back in the day it was the best way. You had clay and you could put it in the fire and it would harden, and there's even now like you can you can find clay pots with writings on them in the ground, and they're still semi-recognizable and you can get information from them still. There was a big change in writing too. in the beginning, like I said, the accountants got a hold of writing before the poets, but that obviously shifted, and thankfully it did, because that was a very, very important moment in our history. There was a big change in writing. It went from symbols like a image of a beer to represent what you're trying to say or sell, um, compared to now you're actually able to portray a message or a feeling through the words that you're writing down. This is more major advancement and very interesting. Writing really brought about a new way of thinking, and it changed so much. It was a way of being creative. It unlocks the doors on things that were never really possible before, such as like money. You need them. Corporations. You can't run a corporation off just writing beers on a tablet. You have to be able to sit there and actually portray your words and your feelings through the tablet. And I think that's just pretty cool. Also, complex forms of society need writing. Writing is essential for all of these things and more. I can promise you there's so much more. Pretty much our entire government system is just based off of writing. Like, if we as a society did not have writing, we would not be even close to where we're at today. And it's really interesting how all of these different things, all of these different tools, the tablet, the axe, they're all just tools, but it was more of the process in which they came about and how they were created that really revolutionized the world around them. And I find that very interesting. So, thank you for coming to my podcast.